magazine. He's been with Commentary since 1994. He's the senior editor there. Gabriel Schoenfeld has written for Commentary on a wide range of issues and subjects, including the Vietnam War, issues of terrorism, nuclear proliferation, the Cold War, and certainly issues of anti-Semitism, as well as 20th century German and Russian history. His articles have been published in other leading journals and magazines, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and the Atlantic Monthly, as well as others. Gabriel Schoenfeld earned his doctorate degree from Harvard University, and as many of you know who studied the issues, contemporary issues of anti-Semitism, he wrote, I think, a very important book in 2004 called The Return of Anti-Semitism, and I think in a way launched the intellectual inquiry into what's happening in the contemporary context on a very important issue. So it's really a privilege to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that generous introduction. And it's really indeed an honor to be here at Yale talking about this important subject. I want to just begin by acknowledging the presence in this room of my sister, Miriam DeMeo, and her husband, Dan DeMeo, who's on the faculty here, and their son, Jonathan, who's a sophomore here. Charles mentioned that I am an editor at Commentary, and I want to use that as a way to begin explaining how I came to write a book about anti-Semitism, which I started working on in 2002. Commentary is published by was at that point published by the American Jewish Committee. It's housed in the offices of the American Jewish Committee. And as I was working in those offices in that building over a decade, I observed as time went by that an ever more stringent set of security measures were being put in place in and around the building. The windows were coated with a laminated glass that, in case of a blast in the street, would not shatter shards on us. Security barriers were placed in the street so that cars could not approach the building. Armed guards and a New York City police officer were at various times stationed in front of the buildings. A device called a man trap that keeps unauthorized people from coming into the building were put in place. Now, in watching all of this, provoked a question in my mind. What is the nature of the threat that people working in the offices of a major American Jewish organization face in this world? And of course, there was a debate going on at that time about resurgent anti-Semitism and whether we were witnessing something new. And one voice in that debate was Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic, the literary editor of the New Republic, who dismissed alarm about resurgent anti-Semitism as what he called ethnic panic. And I wanted to set out on my own and answer the question what it is that we were facing in New York and indeed around the world. I think it's obvious to anyone who's observing contemporary affairs that there is a resurgent anti-Semitism. And I think it's also obvious that the center of that resurgence is the Islamic world. And in particular, two countries, one Sunni, one Shiite, in the heart of the Islamic world, Saudi Arabia and Iran. In both of these countries, one finds an extreme exterminationist brand of anti-Semitism that draws on a variety of motifs, draws on indigenous Islamic sources, fuses them with medieval Christian anti-Semitic themes, brings in certain modern Nazi racial ideas, and propagates this blend of very lethal hatred internally in its, all of its institutions, in its mosques, in its schools, in its textbooks, on their radio stations of these two countries, on the television stations. And I just want to give you, before moving on from this material, to give you a flavor of what the kinds of things that are being put into circulation by these countries. This is an account by the Saudi newspaper Al Riyadh, of how Jews, for the festival of Purim, make pastry we call hamantashen. And the ingredient for this is not poppy seeds in their telling of it, but something else. And just a brief paragraph. They explain that, let us examine now how the victim's blood is spilled. For this, a needle-studded barrel is used. This is a kind of barrel about the size of a human body, with extremely sharp needles set in it on all sides. These needles pierce the victim's body from the moment he is placed in the barrel. These needles do the job, and the victim's blood drips from him slowly. Thus, the victim suffers dreadful torment that affords the Jewish vampires great delight, as they carefully monitor every detail of the bloodshedding with pleasure and love that are difficult to comprehend. Now, this kind of material was, in fact, dramatized in a 24-part television docudrama that was broadcast in Egypt and then exported across the Arab world and across the Islamic world, played in Ramadan. And it is, this kind of very virulent anti-Semitism is ubiquitous and commonplace in these societies. It appears in the theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but it's also prevalent in militantly secular societies like Syria and Libya, and societies that are at peace with Israel like Jordan and Egypt. The Palestinian Authority has peddled some of it, so does Hamas, and of course such incitement is one of the prime factors that underpins the phenomenon of suicide bombings, the willingness to die as long as one takes as many of the evil Jews as possible with one to the grave. Now, it's important to note, I think, that this kind of this Islamic brand of anti-Semitism is not confined to those countries that are near Israel or locked in conflict with Israel, but extends much further afield, thousands of miles away, to countries that have had virtually no contact or no contact at all with Jewish communities. Countries like Malaysia, which never has had a Jewish population, but whose former prime minister, until, 2 years ago, Mohammed Mahathir, over the course of his 25 years in power, repeatedly traded on anti-Semitic themes as a tool of his rule, blaming the financier George Soros and international Jews for manipulating Malaysian currency, publishing tracts like Henry Ford's International Jew for distribution in Malaysia. Similarly, Pakistan, which had a small Jewish community that largely fled in 1948, is a country that, by accounts of Western journalists who've been there and some Pakistani intellectuals, where this anti-Semitic thinking is rife, where the population, there's widespread belief that the attacks of September 11th were organized by the American Jewish community to draw the United States into a war with the Taliban, and all sorts of other anti-Semitic ideas. And of course, some of this is the result of the influence of Saudi Arabia, which has used its oil wealth to finance a dense network of madrasas, of educational institutions in Pakistan, where this kind of material is propagated. And of course, we saw the most tragic manifestation of this in the case of Daniel Pearl, who was forced to utter his last words before he was beheaded were, "My mother is a Jew, my father is a Jew, I am a Jew." That was the last words of his video. Now, Europe would seem to have inoculated itself against this kind of anti-Semitism. World War II, a war against the Jews, led to the total ruin of Western Europe, much of Eastern Europe. Along with 6 million Jews, tens of millions of other Europeans, civilians and soldiers, perished in the war that Hitler unleashed against the Jews. And this indeed has served to inoculate Europe to a large degree against this kind of certain kind of anti-Semitism. There is an anti-Semitic right in Europe, but its electoral ambitions have not really amounted to much. The two exceptions to the rule, perhaps, or maybe they're not exceptions because they themselves have not gotten very far, are Jean-Marie Le Pen, the head of France's National Front, who in 2002 managed to force a runoff in the election with Jacques Chirac, which was the high watermark of his career. But he subsequently lost to Chirac in the largest landslide in the French history of the modern French Republic. And his platform, in any case, was more generally xenophobic than anti-Semitic, although it was not certainly free of that, or tinge of that. And then, of course, there's in Austria, there's the case of Jörg Haider, the head of Austria's Freedom Party, who comes directly from a man who comes directly from a Nazi milieu. His fortune is based upon lands that he inherited from his parents, which was confiscated from Jewish families in Austria. And in 1999, he managed to win, his party managed to win 30% of the vote in Austria. And the New York Times at the time editorialized that this represented the possibly the wave of the future. But in fact, the Freedom Party in elections 3 years after that dropped down to 10%. And it's really remained a rather marginal party. And I think in both instances what's happened is that these xenophobic parties have had their xenophobic message co-opted by more mainstream parties, and they've lost influence. But if this kind of right-wing fascist or Nazi-style anti-Semitism has not been on a tear in Western Europe in the post-war era, this hardly means that anti-Semitism in Europe is dead. For there are other anti-Semitic traditions that are very much in play. And the first and the most obvious is the Islamic one. There's been a profound demographic shift in Europe in the post-war era. If there were 1 million Muslims in Europe, living in Europe in 1945, today that number has swelled to approximately 20 million. And they represent one of the fastest growing populations in Europe, in a world where birth rates are very low. And I'm aware that I'm making some gross generalizations that cover up some significant variations among European Muslims. We go from country to country and from grouping to grouping. But in general, it is a population that is faring very poorly on every indicator of social and economic success. It's suffering from high rates of unemployment, high rates of illiteracy, high rates of incarceration. It is a profoundly alienated population. It is also a population that has brought with it to Europe many of the attitudes and the passions and the hatreds that are ubiquitous in the Islamic world. And it's also a population that is still living in Europe, recipient of broadcasting from the Middle East. Some of these very these hateful television broadcasts are beamed directly into France and Italy from places like Lebanon. And one result of this has been a striking rise in the level of violence directed against the objects of this group's hatred, namely Europe's remaining Jewish population, its institutions, its synagogues, cemeteries, and on individual Jews. And the most dramatic case, I think, has been in France, where we've seen the most activity of this nature, culminating in the torture murder last year of a young French Jew, Ilan Halimi, which seems to have awoken the French government to the nature of the problem at last, and there has been a concerted effort to try and confront it. But the fact is that it's difficult to be a Jew in France today, that French Jews are emigrating from France to Israel in record numbers, that French Jewish parents who typically prided themselves in the past on entering their children to the French public school system are no longer able to do that in many cases. The French schools have become too dangerous for their children. And it's a place where the chief rabbi of France has warned Jews not to wear attire that identifies them as Jews in public, which is a striking thing to be said in Europe of 2007. Now, if the situation in France has begun to ease, and I'm not sure that it really has, Great Britain is now taking center stage, and there are reports just this year that anti-Semitic attacks there increased by 40% in 2006, to the highest levels since records began to be kept in 1984, which is almost certainly connected, this very sharp rise, to this past summer's war between Hezbollah and Israel, which typically provokes a rise in violence in Europe. Now, but beyond what is happening on the streets and that kind of street violence, I think perhaps more important is what is happening among Europe's elites, where another old anti-Semitic tradition is displaying fresh life. And I have in mind here the anti-Semitism of the left. And in post-Holocaust Europe, it is, of course, not respectable at all to speak ill of Jews. But in progressive circles in Europe, a variety of synonyms are employed as a substitute. Among them are the terms, the obvious one being Zionist, slightly less obvious is neoconservative, which are used to disguise, which are used to convey undisguised loathing of both Jews and Israel. At universities across Europe, campaigns have been underway to organize boycotts of Israeli academics. Anyone who is considered an Israeli citizen is treated as a war criminal by some of these campaigns. And all of these campaigns are premised on the mendacious idea that Israel, the Middle East's only liberal democracy, is the world's worst human rights violator. While those organizing these campaigns, these boycott campaigns, maintain near total silence about genuine human rights abuses elsewhere, the ongoing genocide in the Sudan, or unrestrained tyranny in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, in some of this left-wing this progressive anti-Semitism, there are fascinating echoes of the left-wing anti-Semitism of another era. I just want to read a brief quotation from the French socialist Pierre Proudhon, writing in the mid-19th century, a man of the left, who offered his own remarkable solution to the problem posed by the Jews. He said, Proudhon wrote, "We should make a provision against that race, which poisons everything by butting in everywhere, without ever merging in with any people. We should demand its expulsion from France, except for individuals married to French women. Abolish the synagogues. Allow them to enter no employment. Finally proceed with the abolition of this religion. Not for nothing have the Christians called them deicides. The Jew is the enemy of mankind. That race must be sent back to Asia or exterminated." Now, what's astonishing here is not only that Proudhon fully anticipated the solution employed a century later by the Nazis, exterminating the Jews, but also the idea, traceable to the anti-Semitism of the medieval era, that the Jews are the people that poisons everything, the people that poison the well, the people that are responsible for the Black Plague. And this same idea is very much in evidence today. Simon Jenkins, the leading columnist for the London Times, can find no explanation for the war in Iraq other than that Jews, whose first commitment, he says, is to the defense of Israel, have seized the reins of power in Washington and even London. And left-wing magazines in England and in Europe carry cover stories about Zionist cabals, featuring pictures of the Jewish star piercing the U.S. Capitol. It is Jews, once again, who are held responsible for the world's ills in the form of the Jewish state. And it is Jews who refused, as Proudhon had it, to blend in with their neighbors and disappear. Now, particularly striking in this left-wing anti-Semitism is the persistent effort by leading European intellectuals to delegitimize the Jewish state by linking it to the ultimate symbol of evil, Nazi Germany. To be sure, this is not an entirely new phenomenon. Back in the early 1980s, Olof Palme, the Swedish Prime Minister, a leading figure on the European left, he was president of the Socialist International, accused Israel of locking up the Palestinians on the West Bank just in the way the Nazis locked up Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. That caused a huge stir at the time. But what was a shocking novelty in the early 80s is today a commonplace. The Irish poet Tom Paulin has written this poem about Zionist SS gunmen shooting down Palestinian children. José Saramago, the novelist, the Portuguese novelist, in classical anti-Semitic language, says that the Israelis, motivated by the certitude that they are chosen by God, are committing crimes against the Palestinians like those committed by the Nazis at Auschwitz. But of course, all this is a fantasy. There are no gas chambers on the West Bank, and no crematoria, and no genocide is taking place. But the fact is that José Saramago is not a crackpot writing for other crackpots. He is a leading man of letters. He is a Nobel laureate in literature. And the fact that he is giving voice to such ideas is a sign of how far this left-wing anti-Semitism has traveled in Europe. It is also a sign of how some of the most progressive figures on the European stage are actually agents of the most reactionary aspects of the European past. What about the US? Where do we stand in relation to these patterns? I would argue that they appear here, but in the same patterns appear here, but in greatly attenuated form. As in Europe, the anti-Semitic right in the United States is at a low tide. The 1995 Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh discredited the message of all these fringe movements and brought them all under unprecedented police scrutiny. Groups like the Aryan Nation and the militia have been under tremendous pressure, and their memberships are down, and they don't play much of a role, although of course any lone crackpot can do a lot of damage. Conservative intellectuals who have flirted with anti-Semitism have been drummed out of the conservative movement. Just to name two more prominent ones. Jude Wanniski was a distinguished member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, but then began to write, not in the Journal, but elsewhere, papers in defense of the anti-Semitic pronouncements of Louis Farrakhan. And he was let go from the Journal, and the next thing one knew, he was really a crackpot writing for a website, and that was the extent of his influence. Joseph Sobran, who was a columnist for William Buckley's National Review, a leading conservative magazine, also began at some point, I believe in the 70s, writing a series of truly outrageous anti-Semitic articles, not in National Review, but elsewhere. And he was forced off of the masthead of National Review by Bill Buckley, and is now last seen consorting with the folks at the Institute for Historical Review, which is a Holocaust denial outfit operating in California. So he has also been moved to the far margins. When various fundamentalist Christian leaders like Pat Robertson have given voice to anti-Semitic ideas, they have come in for vociferous criticism from across the spectrum. Anti-Semitic politicians on the right have not gotten very far at all. David Duke in 1991, perhaps the leading exception, he managed to get 30% of the vote in a Louisiana gubernatorial election, but it's been downhill for him ever since. He had a fraud conviction, he served time in prison, and he has serviced most recently, not surprisingly, at the Holocaust Denial Convention in Tehran late last year. Pat Buchanan, who has flirted with anti-Semitism repeatedly over the years. His various presidential runs amounted to nothing on both the Republican line and the populist line. And running in 2000 as a populist, and not really making much of his anti-Semitic ideas along the way, incidentally, he did not prove to be very popular. He received 0.04% of the popular vote. So if the right, this right-wing anti-Semitism is not flourishing, the other traditions are doing slightly better. As in Europe, we have our own indigenous and Islamic anti-Semitism. We have some 2 to 4 million Muslims in the United States. Perhaps 3/4 of them are immigrants. This is a population that is much better integrated into American life than is the case in Europe, and much more prosperous and thriving. But still, there are elements in this population that are publishing blatantly anti-Semitic material. The Arab Voice, one of their major newspapers, has republished Protocols of the Elders of Zion. There's ubiquitous articles and books in Islamic bookstores, in Arabic language bookstores, in which the thesis is put forward that Jews are responsible for or Israel is responsible for the attacks of September 11th, and so forth. And this Islamic population, like Jewish population, like the Christian population in this country, has organized its own system of day schools and Sunday schools to convey their faith to their children. And according to reporting by the New York Times and the Washington Post, many of the textbooks in use in these schools, where there's some 30,000, 40,000 kids being exposed to this material, are textbooks which have been imported from Saudi Arabia and which teach things like that Jews are the sons of monkeys and apes, that Jews worship money, and other standard and not so standard anti-Semitic tropes. Now, unlike in Europe, we also have a black Muslim population with very special circumstances, including the fact that some 300,000 to 400,000 black Muslims in this country are incarcerated in prisons. And these inmates, like other inmates, have religious needs that must be catered to. And in one institution after another, it turns out, the authorities have turned to Saudi-trained imams to administer religious counseling in the prisons. So we have a situation where a sector of American society that is most prone to violence is being indoctrinated in some of the most fundamental brand of Islam, including in some instances directly its anti-Semitic teachings. And actually, as an editor and commentator, I've received letters from prisoners, Jewish prisoners, just complaining about the situation in their prisoners over the years. But the sum total of all of these trends is that we've seen an upsurge in violence against Jews committed by Muslims. If in the past that kind of violence, synagogue desecration, cemetery desecration, was carried out largely by skinheads, increasingly it's carried out by Muslim youth. But apart from that, that kind of low-level violence, we've also had a number of more spectacular attacks, which I think bear mention. There was, just to mention before, on the Brooklyn Bridge in 1994, a Lebanese Muslim opened fire on a van carrying Hasidic young people and killed one. There was a 1997 attack on the top floor of the Empire State Building by a Palestinian gunman who killed one person. He said in his confession that his aim was to kill as many Jews as possible. There was a 2002 attack by an Egyptian immigrant on the LL ticket counter in Los Angeles. And just last year, of course, in Seattle, a US-born Muslim stormed the Seattle Jewish Center and killed one woman and shot 5 others. So the security doors around my building are definitely there for a reason. That's one of them. Now, as in Europe, the United States has its own, also has its own left-wing anti-Semitism. Now, I would argue there's been a certain measure of recent trend is that there's been a certain measure of tolerance within the Democratic Party for candidates who have openly expressed anti-Semitic ideas. And the most significant case, of course, is that of the Reverend Al Sharpton, who in the 1991 Crown Heights riots openly fanned the embers of anti-Semitism by declaiming against diamond merchants from Tel Aviv who were robbing the black community. He subsequently led a boycott of a Jewish-owned store in Harlem, Freddy's, where there was a lot of incitement, including incitement to burn it down. That incitement didn't come from him, but the store did indeed burn down, killing 8 employees. Now, the media and the leading Democrats who avidly court his support make absolutely no mention of this. He participates in the debates as an equal. In fact, he is the one who's allowed to lecture other candidates on race relations. And his whole history of anti-Semitic pronouncements has become a taboo subject in the party and in the media itself. Now, as in Europe, much of this left-wing anti-Semitism can also be found in universities. We saw this particularly when the Second Intifada was at its height, that there were demonstrations on campuses across the country in which placards were held up, in which the Jewish star was equated with the Nazi swastika, placards bearing pictures of dead babies labeled slaughtered according to kosher rites were visible. But beyond these, again, street-level activities, there have been activity in the elite faculties as well, including in the Ivy League faculties, where there has been a movement, somewhat now in abeyance, to single out Israel as the world's worst human rights violator, and as the only country that institutions like Yale, MIT, Harvard should divest their stocks from. And as I say, this campaign is, I think it's not done all that well. I don't hear that much about it right now, but the universities have now given birth to another controversy in which 2 leading political scientists, John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago and Stephen Walt of Kennedy School at Harvard, have published this paper about the undue influence of the Israel lobby. But the way they define that is essentially American Jewry as a whole, and the paper itself raises the question, or directly suggests, that American Jews have dual loyalties, which is a time-honored anti-Semitic canard, and which, in fact, does not mean dual loyalties at all, but actually means single loyalties, loyalty to their fellow Jews ahead of loyalty to the United States. And this is an argument that they've made at great length with a great many footnotes, but they're wrapping an old anti-Semitic idea in scholarly garb. Now, Mearsheimer and Walt would strenuously deny that there's anything anti-Semitic about their paper. Indeed, they insist that they themselves are philo-Semitic, as they told interviewers in England, which brings me to 2 concluding points that I would like to make. Which is, first, is that just as there is something called Holocaust denial, there is something called anti-Semitism denial, which is a refusal to call things by their proper names. I'll just give a few instances I encountered in the course of writing my book. There was a riot in Ukraine in which youth were chanting "Death to the Kikes" in the street. And the following day, the mayor of Kiev had a press conference. He was asked by several journalists about this, and he explained that it was not anti-Semitism, it was just hooliganism. Jacques Chirac, president of France, at one point he said there's no anti-Semitism and no anti-Semites in France. He subsequently adopted a less denying point of view. And I had my own peculiar encounter with this while I was researching the book. I came across a quotation from a student newspaper at Rutgers that I wanted to track down and authenticate. It said something like, it said exactly like, "Die, Jew, die, 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 build yourself an oven, die." And I called the faculty member at Rutgers who was responsible for this publication. I didn't have an original copy. I'd just seen it quoted somewhere. And I wanted her to tell me whether it in fact appeared and also what she could tell me about it. And she did confirm that it appeared. And she said, but she asked me what I was using it for, and I said, I'm writing a book about anti-Semitism. And she said, oh, Mr. Schoenfeld, you don't understand. That's not anti-Semitism. That's just students blowing off steam. So I think there's a refusal in some quarters to face exactly where we are. The dangers that are on the horizon are very various, and I think it's important not to exaggerate them and to analyze each of them according to its own situation. But I don't think that it's fair to say that the Jewish world, as Leon Wieseltier would have it, is in a state of ethnic panic. And indeed, given the fact that there is a regime, the Iranian regime, which is imbued with anti-Semitic hatred, whose president openly denies the Holocaust, and whose president openly speaks of annihilating the Jewish state, or wiping it from the map. And it's a regime that is engaged in terrorism against the Jewish world, blowing up the Jewish Cultural Center in Argentina and the Israeli embassy there in the 1990s. And a regime now intent on acquiring nuclear weapons, and according to best intelligence estimates, is 2 or 3 years away from actually acquiring such weapons. Comparisons, in some respects, to the dangers faced by the Jews in the 1930s are not completely out of order. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So, Dr. Schoenfeld has agreed to take questions.
Specifically, early on in your talk, you mentioned about the anti-Semitism in the Muslim world and the publications there and the television shows. So I wanted to know about 2 things. One, what can be done to combat it in the Muslim world? And 2, to what extent is it bad faith versus if everywhere you look there are publications of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, people come to believe, oh, well, it must be true. So to what extent is it driven by bad faith, you think, versus ignorance or misinformation?
I think it's largely not driven by bad faith, but is taken on a life of its own and accepted as truth by large segments of the population. Now, when it goes into intellectual circles, things become more murky, but I think it's not an accident that the leading Egyptian journalist, Mohammed Haikal, who wrote, I mean, some of the best histories of, let's say, the Yom Kippur War from the Arab side, a reputable historian, a man who moves in, comfortably in European capitals, has endorsed the works of David Irving, the British Holocaust denier, and so there's, I think there's, I don't know if it's bad faith or not, but it's a fact that these beliefs are top to bottom. They're not just at the grassroots; they're in the elite, and they're. As for combating them, that's a very difficult problem. Apart from regime change, what measures short of regime change can be employed? There is some Western broadcasting into some of these societies, which I think can play an important role. There are institutions like Memory, that Yigal Khanun, I believe you spoke here, go about just assembling some of the more extreme things in the press and distributing them, and I think calling attention to them can have something, is a very, very necessary first step in combating them. But I myself do not have a program beyond that for dealing with this.
And so, Alon, and then you, and if you sort of indicate to me, I'll put this down on this.
Yeah, so there is some kind of a paradox, maybe you can feel from the left traditionally was very much trying to rely on civil rights. Again, generally it's but how do you speak up? Yes, I said the general notion is that the left is very much aware of civil rights. How does it fit with this paradox of left supporting anti-Semitism if one can consider, anti-Semitism as an issue of civil rights?
Well, it's a very good question, and I guess the way I would answer it is that the left and liberalism are composed of many strands of thought, and some of them are very much in contradiction with one another. And there is, of course, a true liberal strand on the left that believes in civil rights and defends civil rights and advocates civil rights. But there are other strands that go back to the Enlightenment. You know, Voltaire, who in his anti-clericalism became extremely anti-Judaic, looking at Judaism as the tree trunk from which Christianity, which he hated, had grown. And he wanted to extirpate both. And there's this gave voice to the whole stream of anti-Semitic thought in the 19th century, and you have quotations like that from Proudhon, but if you go through the works of Marx, himself a Jew, of course, you can find these, in the socialist tradition, a great deal of anti-Semitic hatred. So these schools exist in tension with each other, and are manifest today on the left by people who are not thinking in these terms, but are somehow echoing these older voices.
One of the kind of touchier issues, I think, surrounding anti-Semitism today is, and you touched on it briefly, especially with Walter Mearsheimer, the issue of can one equate, or how much one can equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And this, I think, also recently has become a very hot issue with to what extent the left in the American Jewish community that's very critical of Israel is almost anti-Semitic or self-hating. So could you talk a little bit about is there a distinction? If there is, what is...
Well, I think it really depends here how we would define anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is the belief that there should be no Jewish state in the Middle East. I would have to call that anti-Semitic, because the practical consequences of that would be to lead to the death of the Jewish population of Israel. I mean, where are they going to go, and are they going to live under the regime of Hezbollah or Hamas? Or that seems to me like fairly simple. I think matters get much more murky when we're talking about criticism of what Israel does in particular instances, and some of those criticisms can be anti-Semitic, some can't be. Just to give an example of a kind of criticism that I would regard as anti-Semitic, when, for example, in 1994, and this hotel was blown up in Netanya, and Israel launched an incursion to Jenin, the refugee camp, to try and apprehend the perpetrators. All sorts of people were condemning Israel for the crime of genocide. And this, I think, this kind of extreme exaggeration, there were, I think, a total of 50 people, Palestinians, most of them were armed gunmen, died in that gun battle. To call that genocide, I think, is to really misuse language and then to raise the question of why you're misusing language. But I think to raise objections to where Israel puts its security barrier, all sorts of other questions are not necessarily motivated by bad faith and could be perfectly legitimate. But I think one has to go on a case-by-case basis. There's no bright line.
I have two questions, Gabriel. One is, where in the pantheon of Jew haters or critics of Israel would you put Jimmy Carter? Secondly, I'm from Canada. We believe in freedom of speech, but we also believe in freedom from speech, which means we have some pretty stringent anti-hate laws. And given the extent of hate on the internet, which I think culminated in the attack on Elie Wiesel last week by one of these right-wing guys that also foment anti-Semitism, which he claimed to have picked up on the internet. What recommendations, as an American, I understand how sensitive you are about the First Amendment, would you make about use of media, particularly the internet, in fomenting violence against a specific group?
Both excellent questions. Jimmy Carter is an interesting case, and he just published this very controversial book, which we all have been hearing about, and he's both at Brandeis. There's some things in that book that really make you wonder about where he fits in the anti-Semitic tradition. He criticizes Israelis for not being religious and for desecrating Christian sites or not behaving properly toward Christians. And there's some Christian motifs in his anti-Semitism, and I think arguably anti-Semitism in the way he this kind of double standard that he refuses to criticize any act of Palestinian terrorism in that book, but hammers Israel for all sorts of things, and raises questions about his motives in doing that. But I can't go deeper into his psyche than that, and I haven't read his book, so I'm just relying on reviews, including an excellent one that we published in the February issue of Commentary. As far as the hate crime laws and controlling the internet, I really don't see a possibility for that here in this country. I personally am not opposed to when Austria locks up a Holocaust denier like David Irving, he was locked up for 3 years. That doesn't trouble me. I don't think that we need to export our First Amendment around the world to situations where history is very different and much more fraught. I'm basically a liberal on this issue. I think that speech should be answered by speech. Violence and incitement to violence are matter, and there, it's direct incitement there. Otherwise, that do allow for intervention. But there's
my question is, why hasn't the American phenomenon pushing both liberal and conservative anti-Semites to the fringes of political and academic spheres, why hasn't that been successful or been mirrored in Western Europe?
Well, the histories are just so different, and the soil in Europe is so much more fertile for this kind of thing. The United States has really never been a place where anti-Semitism has enjoyed much popularity. I mean, there's some exceptions and some exceptional periods, but whereas a melting pot, there are other groups that have been beneath the Jews in our history. Of course, American blacks occupy a space that's far below them, but in the 19th century, you had Catholics and Italians who were the objects of prejudice. So the Jews are not at the bottom. And while in Europe, for all sorts of historical reasons, many volumes have been written about, they are have been a targeted minority and remain so, even though they've largely been destroyed.
Yeah, and also two questions for you. Pakistan is very complicated because here you've got Musharraf who met with the Americans in the Congress and encouraged a group of American Pakistanis to go to Israel, and they did, and report back to them. And at the same time, I don't remember hearing Musharraf cry out that Daniel Pearl was murdered, nor any changes in the textbooks there and things like that. So I wonder if you had gone any deeper into the issues in Pakistan. And the second question is, in Connecticut, what's facing right now is University of Connecticut has traveled to Dubai, has been talking to Dubai about a branch campus, and because we're speaking out that maybe that's not such a good idea, they're putting it on hold right now. On the other hand, Abe Foxman is going to Dubai, the Conference of Presidents of Jewish Organizations is going to Dubai, and Shimon Peres, not too long ago, was next door with the United Arab Emirates. So I guess the question is have we seen anti-Semitism in those areas? Is there a possibility of some moderation there? The politics might actually be a little more open.
I don't have really much more additional insight into the situation in Pakistan. One caveat that I have one of my 3 daughters, all of them in the past attended public schools in New York with a large Pakistani population. And all of my children have reported various episodes of blatantly anti-Semitic pronouncements by fellow students and parents of those students. So I think this is just a very poor immigrant community. But these ideas are prevalent, are quite prevalent. It's not just media reports. I've seen this with I've heard this with my own ears from my children. The Gulf states, they're small, and I think they're in various ways they're easier states to modernize. They have the resources, and I think there is more hope for them that they were going to move away from these radical ideas. They have a strong interest in combating Islamic terrorism, which thrives on this kind of hatred and in fact is organized around it. So I think, I don't know the specifics of what your school is organizing, but I'm not for closing all doors, and I think there has to be a process of influence at work in dealing with these countries.
Okay.
I wonder if you would agree that the rise of anti-Semitism is highly correlated with the lower standing in many people's eyes of Israel's behavior. If you agree with that, I wonder if you would take the U.S. situation first. If the fact that the Jewish leadership in the United States, I'm not going to go with this, but the Jewish leadership seems to be unwilling to decide when it should support what Israel is doing, when it should not support. You should say to yourself, sometimes they do good things, sometimes not so good things. We all agree on that. But the Jewish leadership doesn't differentiate. The word is black and white. It's almost like Bush saying either for us or against us. That word is not like that. The word is gray, not black and white. So the question I have is, in Israel, people do object to certain things that Israel is doing. Others do not object. But in the U.S., you don't get that in the leadership. And I think that's what leads to the kind of anti-Jewish feeling among many people that we are, in fact, monolithically in favor of Israel, no matter what they do.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I'm not sure how true that picture is. There's some elements of truth in it, but having inhabited, worked closely with people in a major Jewish organization, I'm not affiliated with that organization, but I've seen them up close. I don't think that they follow every twist and turn of Israeli politics faithfully, and that sometimes they distance themselves from it, sometimes they choose to support Israel more heavily on one issue, and sometimes they just remain silent. They don't, I think, like to be, it's fair to say, they like to be in a position of criticizing Israel. That's not what they see their role as doing, but they don't defend everything Israel does slavishly. And I don't think, in the final analysis, that what the Jewish American organizations do or don't do is what's promoting this anti-Semitism. I think I see it much more as a irrational phenomenon that has roots in all sorts of resentments and hatreds that are not susceptible to change. But I also think that the first part of your question is relevant in that when Israel was much stronger and had unquestioned superiority in the Middle East, but it was after the 67 war, we didn't see very much of this. It was really after 73, and when Israel suffered its first major defeat, that we began to see a great deal more sympathy on the left and other sectors for Israel's critics, and including some of the more radical ones.
You see it only as a military superiority?
Well, its entire sense of Iran is also eroded. It's not. I think it's become. It's not a fashionable country to support. It's become deeply unfashionable for lots of reasons. And now, of course, its leadership is in kind of unbelievable malaise that can't help. But I don't see this really as, in the end, as a result of anything Israel does or doesn't do. I mean, I think it's a factor, but it's not the decisive factor.
I just wanted to answer what I think I've heard about the civil rights, the liberal issue about why people against Israel go with it. Well, one of the things people say, and I'm not speaking for myself, is that the Palestinians have been, locked up or whatever, all the kinds of things, which all have some truth, but not, I personally don't believe that Israelis are responsible, but that's the kind of thing I've heard about people who feel that Israel was, violating.
Right, well, I mean, that's clearly, yes, that's clearly.
And you didn't
yes.
answer, you had another answer.
I had another answer, but I think your answer is.
Maybe superficial.
Well, it seems valid as well. I just didn't go in that direction for whatever reason.
Since you ventured into the area of Muslim terrorism, I'd like to ask you the most effective terrorism that the Muslims, Palestinians used against the Israelis were, of course, the suicide bombings, and there was no criticism of that. Now they have extended that technique to blowing up each other with the destruction of the Shiite the Golden Dome, blowing up Shiites, blowing up Sunnis, and Sunnis blowing up Shiites, Arabs, Muslim Arabs destroying black Muslims in Dhofar and Chad, and the absence of any criticism by the clerics of Islam and the intellectuals of Islam. I understand why they didn't care when Jews were blown up, but what's the psychopathology?
Well, I mean, the prevalence of anti-Semitism is a classic indicator of a very sick society.
Yes.
And so it's not surprising that that sickness is spread, not only, and the victims of that sickness, and not only Jews in the Arab world and the Islamic world generally. There's so few Jews left that these sick societies are turning on themselves and each other and waging war against each other, and which is what we're seeing now in the really open Sunni-Shiite split that's dividing the Middle East, which holds some interesting opportunities for Israel in a strategic way, possibilities of alliances, in fact, against Shiites and some of the Sunni regimes that have been talked about more. But as you say, the clerics are not likely to be making criticisms of either side without fear of consequences. It's a very violent world where people are abducted, tortured, and killed. So it's risky to raise one's voice against many things in these tyrannical societies.
Yeah, I guess I found your account of the right's renunciation of anti-Semitic elements a little bit unconvincing, and I'm thinking, somebody like Pat Buchanan has sort of received the Sister Souljah treatment from the right. There are a lot of people who didn't get the memo, like MSNBC and his 50,000 subscribers to his magazine and Reagan Books or whoever publishes his books. And just to compare him with somebody like Al Sharpton, I would say they're equally corrosive and divisive figures, but I'd also say they occupy equally sort of unmarginalized or not marginalized and not kind of positions. If you look at their electoral success, I think Pat Buchanan did a heck of a lot better in 1992 than Al Sharpton ever did. He maxed out about 15% in South Carolina. So, I mean, if you're using that as a rubric. So I just thought your account of the right was just a little bit Pollyannish, and I think kind of long-term, I mean, isn't maybe the long-term threat from the right still the more dangerous?
First of all, all your remarks about what I said seem on target. I really was talking about the electoral prospects of Buchanan, but I do agree with you that he's not been marginalized. He's accepted in these mainstream places. Certainly not accepted in the Republican Party, though, because he's left the party and he's a liability for the party. But he is part of the mainstream media culture. I just don't see the evidence that would point to the right being the long-term danger in this country for the anti-Semitic movement. I see, to the extent that I see trouble, I see it coming from the Islamic world and from the left, and I in chapter and verse. I think Walt and Mearsheimer represent an interesting new twist because they're not on the left. They're really centrist, realist types. So it's a kind of emergence of this kind of dangerous current right in the very center of the establishment. I don't think I don't know if you would call that the right or not, but it seems to me just dead center.
To what extent do you think anti-Semitism in the Arab world or the Middle East in general, the Islamic world, is sort of a function of a resurgence in pan-Arabism, maybe as an attempt to sort of unite what are currently divided forces?
Well, I think anti-Semitism plays a role that is something like that. I mean, it's a very convenient message for regimes that have a lot to answer for, regimes that have really failed their people, that have not. If you read the Arab Human Development Report, the successive Arab Human Development Reports, these are documents produced by the United Nations, by Arab intellectual organizations that appraise Arab societies and compare them to other societies. I mean, these are really societies in horrific condition. and I mean, low rates of illiteracy. I mean, I think the combined Arab GDP, including petroleum, is less than the annual GDP of Spain, one European country. These are countries that are not doing well, and anti-Semitism plays a vital role in pointing to a place where you can point to blame for the ills of these societies. And Israel plays a vital role as well. It's fomenting hatred of Jews, of Israel, of the West, of Christians as well, is that, I think, the answer to your question.
In recent decades, we've seen strong philo-Semitic sentiments and pro-Zionist sentiments coming from evangelical Christians, perhaps driven by the faith in the Bible. Is there anything like that going on in Europe?
Not that I'm aware of. Not at all. I really don't, I don't know. I mean, I think it would be right to point out that that the Catholic Church in Europe and generally around the world has made huge strides in trying to reconcile with Judaism and Jews in Israel over the last 30 years. It's not, doesn't have the influence it does in Europe in such secular societies, but to the extent it has influence, it has made very dramatic progress in its understanding of Judaism and its renunciation of its own anti-Semitic teachings and in establishing better relations with Israel. So there is a kind of counterpart, I suppose.
Will?
So far, thank you very much for your comments today, and I really agree with basically everything I've heard you say. But nonetheless, I feel like there's something missing still. And we've heard a lot of the historical, political roots of anti-Semitism and the different strains, left and right, Islamic and secular. But I think there's something to be said for the dispossession of the Palestinians in the 20th century, and that this is a cause of much of the resentment. The creation of the State of Israel was by force of arms. The Arabs were not represented when Israel was declared. And the Arab states today, supposedly, will make peace. They have agreed to a lot of the things, the UN resolutions, basically the Camp David framework for peace. And I wonder if, you could address that at all.
Well, I'll try to. I think there's some truth to that the plight of the Palestinians has, and the territorial conflict that provoked by Israel's creation undoubtedly has a dimension that is free from all these other things, but it's very tangled in and it's very hard to disentangle what it is. But I would also point out that many of these currents preceded the formation of the State of Israel, that the Arab states were aligned with Nazi Germany, and that during the war that Iraq was, and that there were the Mufti of Jerusalem, and that these Nazi racialist anti-Semitism was very prevalent in the Arab world prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, that these ideas were cultivated before and were growing long before Israel was attacked in 1967 and came into possession of the West Bank and Gaza, and that I don't agree with that the Arab states at this point are willing and ready to make peace with Israel in terms that responsible Israel.
Jimmy Carter says so in his book.
Palestinian Arabs were represented in the UN. Not the true, all the Arab states were represented in the UN. And in addition to that, larger number of Jews were dispossessed in the Arab countries. Then the Palestinian Arabs were dispossessed from their places in the land of Israel. Now, this is not what I'm going to say, but it ties in. In light of what you said, that essentially Arab anti-Semitism is state-supported and many times organized. What is the sense of let's say, the future
value of peace negotiations on these grounds? Is it really sincere attempt or effort by the Arab state or elements, or is it just an exercise in gaining a better position for the future? As a process of eliminating the Jews eventually or the second result?
Well, I think the best case study here clearly would be Egypt, which society that they said the Camp David Accords have been in existence now for how long? Since 1979, and basically held, despite the fact that Egypt remains a society where there's a great deal of state-supported anti-Semitism, and largely because I think it's in Egypt's interest not to wage war against Israel. It has other strategic issues in the region. Those may change. I think that the great danger in dealing with any autocracy, especially one that peddles hateful ideology like this, is that they're unstable, that they could be toppled tomorrow, that agreements are ultimately just pieces of paper. And Israel, or any state trying to enter peace negotiations with such a state, has to take into account their instability and their fundamental nature and the attitudes expressed by that are prevalent in the population. I think so. The statesman has to take those things into account. Israel, I think, is cognizant of what developments are in Israel, in Egypt, and in Jordan for that matter too. But sees it as its interest to maintain a state of peace with these countries, and has done so successfully.
I don't negate what you said, but I'm trying to get your assessment as to what's the value of these.
Well, Israel has been, I mean, in these cases...
Is it temporary or is it long-lasting?
Well, well, I'm not a prophet, so one sees, erosion and the way the treaties are, some of the language that the Egyptians use, and ups and downs in the relationship, but I think that these seeking treaties with peace treaties with your adversaries is a good thing, unquestionably. And I think, but it has to be done in a clear-eyed way. It's just signing a piece of paper is not adequate. There has to be verifiable disarmament and genuine peace rather than cold peace, ultimately, for real peace to arrive in the region.
Yes, I want to thank you and ask you, do you see the need for a new Jewish organization whose mission it would be to combat anti-Semitism all over the world, 24 hours a day, to reply to all these things that happen, to educate and so forth? I don't see an organization that's doing that now on behalf of the Jews.
I think that might be a useful thing, because there is an organization that really ostensibly has that as its mission, which is the Anti-Defamation League. But I think under Abe Foxman, I've been a critic not of everything they've done, but I feel that they've been quite slow in recognizing some of the challenges that the Jewish world faces, and that they've been much more oriented traditionally toward the threat from the right. Foxman himself is a refugee from Poland, and more concerned about the right-wing side of this equation, which is fair enough, but slow to recognize some of the other developments. And so whether a new organization is needed or a new leadership of the old organization, I don't have the answer, but I think that these questions require urgent attention.
Thank you.
This will be the last question. Is there anybody else?
You painted a very bleak picture concerning Iran, a very frightening picture, actually. And I just wonder, do you know anything about the opposition that used to be there? That was a very thriving opposition. One doesn't hear a thing about them.
Well, there is still a thriving opposition in Iran. And in fact, it's not just an opposition, there's actually open conflict in different portions of the country. The Persians are only, I think, 50% of the population. There are these Kurds, these other minority groups that are really loggerheads. So with the regime, so there's this ethnic fracturing. What's more, I'm very alarmed about developments in Iran. Who couldn't be given what the pronouncements of the president. It's not clear that the analogy to the 1930s works with him, and his position is not nearly as secure as, say, Hitler is. He's just suffered defeat in his local elections. There's a lot of turmoil and ferment inside of Iran. The question in my mind is whether that turmoil and ferment is going to lead to the kind of fundamental change that I hope Iran sees before or after it acquires nuclear weapons. And I think we really can't wait. Israel, the United States should not wait around to find out the answer.
So we'll take the last question.
I just had one comment to make regarding the two intellectual professors who feel that the Jews have one position or one political position, and I suggest that they study the recent senatorial campaign in Connecticut. I think that that really reflects some sincere and serious divisions in political points of view.
Thank you.
So, just one brief announcement. Next week, Bassam Tibi from the University of Hamburg will be speaking here on the issues of radical Islam. He'll be in this room at 4:15 next week. On behalf of everybody here, I really have to thank you for our wonderful
across the Islamic world, played in Ramadan, and it is this kind of very virulent anti-Semitism is ubiquitous and commonplace in these societies. It appears in the theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia, but it's also in also prevalent in militantly secular societies like Syria and Libya, and societies that are at peace with Israel like Jordan and Egypt. The Palestinian Authority has peddled some of it, so does Hamas, and of course such incitement is one of the prime factors that underpins the phenomenon of suicide bombings, the willingness to die as long as one takes as many of the evil Jews as possible with one to the grave. Now, it's important to note, I think, that this kind of this Islamic brand of anti-Semitism is not confined to those countries that are near Israel or locked in conflict with Israel, but extends much further afield, thousands of miles away, to countries that have had virtually no contact or no contact at all with Jewish communities. Countries like Malaysia, which never has had a Jewish population, but whose former prime minister, until 2 years ago, Mohammed Mahathir, over the course of his 25 years in power, repeatedly traded on anti-Semitic themes as a tool of his rule, blaming the finding whether we were witnessing something new. And one voice in that debate was Leon Wieseltier of the New Republic, the literary editor of the New Republic, who dismissed alarm about researching anti-Semitism as what he called ethnic panic. And I wanted to set out on my own and answer the question what it is that we were facing in New York and indeed around the world. I think it's obvious to anyone who's observing contemporary affairs that there is a resurgent anti-Semitism. And I think it's also obvious that the center of that resurgence is the Islamic world. And in particular, two countries, one Sunni, one Shiite, in the heart of the Islamic world, Saudi Arabia and Iran. In both of these countries, one finds an extreme exterminationist brand of anti-Semitism that draws on a variety of motifs, draws on indigenous Islamic sources, fuses them with medieval Christian anti-Semitic themes, brings in certain modern Nazi racial ideas, and propagates this blend of very lethal hatred internally in its all of its institutions, in its mosques, in its schools.
Magazine has been with Commentary since 1994. He's the senior editor there. Gabriel Schoenfeld has written for Commentary on a wide range of issues and subjects, including the Vietnam War, issues of terrorism, nuclear proliferation, the Cold War, and certainly issues of anti-Semitism, as well as 20th century German and Russian history. His articles have been published in other leading journals and magazines, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New Republic, and the Atlantic Monthly, as well as others. Gabriel Schoenfeld earned his doctorate degree from Harvard University, and as many of you know who studied issues, contemporary issues of anti-Semitism, he wrote, I think, a very important book in 2004 called The Return of Anti-Semitism, and I think in a way launched the intellectual inquiry into what's happening in the contemporary context on a very important issue. So it's really a privilege to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that generous introduction. And it's really an honor to be here at Yale talking about this important subject. I want to just begin by acknowledging the presence in this room of my sister, Miriam DeMeo, and her husband, Dan DeMeo, who's on the faculty here, and their son, Jonathan, who's a sophomore here. Charles mentioned that I am an editor at Commentary, and I want to use that as a way to begin explaining how I came to write a book about anti-Semitism, which I started working on in 2002. Commentary is published by was at that point published by the American Jewish Committee. It's housed in the offices of the American Jewish Committee. And as I was working in those offices in that building over a decade, I observed as time went by that an ever more stringent set of security measures were being put in place in and around the building. The windows were coated with a laminated glass that, in case of a blast in the street, would not shatter shards on us. Security barriers were placed in the street so that cars could not approach the building. Armed guards and a New York City police officer were at various times stationed in front of the buildings. A device called a man trap that keeps unauthorized people from coming into the building were put in place. Now, in watching all of this, provoked a question in my mind. What is the nature of the threat that people working in the offices of a major American Jewish organization face in this world? And of course, there was a debate going on at that time about resurgent anti-Semitism. In its textbooks, on their radio stations of these two countries, on the television stations. And I just want to give you, before moving on from this material, to give you a flavor of what the kinds of things that are being put into circulation by these countries. This is an account by the Saudi newspaper Al Riyadh of how Jews, for the festival of Purim, make a pastry we call hamantashen. And the ingredient for this is not poppy seeds in their telling of it, but something else. And just a brief paragraph. They explain that, let us examine now how the victim's blood is spilled. For this, a needle-studded barrel is used. This is a kind of barrel about the size of the human body, with extremely sharp needles set in it on all sides. These needles pierce the victim's body from the moment he is placed in the barrel. These needles do the job, and the victim's blood drips from him slowly. Thus, the victim suffers dreadful torment that affords the Jewish vampires great delight as they carefully monitor every detail of the bloodshedding with pleasure and love that are difficult to comprehend. Now, this kind of material was, in fact, dramatized in a 24-part television docudrama that was broadcast in Egypt and then exported across the Arab